I am so excited to be facilitating this panel. As far as I'm concerned, this panel was really the heart of this conference. My own book is thinking about radical internationalism and global networks related to the Mexican Revolution, and I have learned so much from the three panelists sitting on stage here. Today we're going to be thinking together about recovering global radicalism. And I just want to say something about the word recovering. When we say we're recovering or revisiting this history, it's not because we're saying that everybody got everything exactly right in the past, but because we think we have a lot to learn from it. As our second keynote speaker, Vijay Prashad, says, we can learn to think about the past as a resource, not as a destination. So let me introduce our speakers in the order that they are going to speak today. First is Ani Mukherji. Ani is an assistant professor of American Studies at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. His work appears in places like American Communist History and Africa and Europe, Studies in Transnational Practice in the Long 20th Century. I am very proud to announce that Ani is currently working on his first book project, The Anti-Colonial Imagination, Race, Empire, and Migrant Radicalism Before World War II. He will be having a book talk right here at the People's Forum on November 3rd. Write it down, November 3rd, Ani Mukherji. Following Ani will be the one and only Lisa Armstrong, who is joining us from Northampton, Massachusetts today, where she teaches courses on gender and, let me get it right, movements for social, economic, and environmental change, emancipatory cultural studies, and feminist archives. I won't read her whole bio because it's in the program, but I do want to say that we're so excited that she'll be presenting on some new work that builds off a recent article she wrote in Signs, which describes solidarity methods developed in the Women's International Democratic Foundation and the anti-imperialist Pan-Asian women's movements from 1942 until 1960. So looking forward to that. And last but not least, fresh from her first day of classes, the first day of classes of the semester at Essex County College in Newark, New Jersey, Margaret Stevens is with us today. We're very lucky to have her. Margaret is a scholar, a community leader, and associate professor of history, and the director of the Urban Issues Institute at Essex County College. She is the author of the newly published Red International and Black Caribbean, Communists in New York City, Mexico, and the West Indies, and a contributor to Communist Histories, edited by Vijay Prashad. So without further ado, please help me welcome the panel and Ani Mukherji, who will speak first.
Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking the organizers, especially Manu, Jordan, and Christina, the folks from BCRW, including especially Avi and Pam, and everyone from the People's Forum for creating this great space to give a talk, and I'm very excited to be here today. My talk, in the PowerPoints back there, is Solidarities in Internationalism, Lessons from the Communist Struggles Against Empire and Racism, and I'm focusing on the 1920s and 30s. Historians often get up in front of audiences of scholars and activists in order to tell people lessons from the past with the implied message, you're doing it wrong. That's not what I'm up here to do today. I want to talk about some lessons from the past with two thoughts. The first one, to amplify what we're doing right in this moment. And the second one, to broaden our collective imagination of what is possible. One of my mentors was a veteran of the late 1960s radical movements. And I remember he was asked if he felt that his movement had gone too far in the late 1960s, and if that was why he wasn't able to seize the moment of opportunity that was presented to him. His reply has stuck with me. We didn't go far enough. We didn't push hard enough. I think that we're in, or at least coming up on, a similar moment today. The question and spirit guiding my talk today is, how can we go far enough to win? What can we learn from the past in order to help us achieve some lasting victories? The specific subject of my talk is the anti-colonial and anti-racist organizing that happened under the banner of the Communist International in the 1920s and 30s. In particular, I want to focus on theories and practices of solidarity and internationalism taken up by communists working in or moving through the United States. The domestic anti-racist work of the Communist Party in this period is now known thanks to the intellectual work of people like Gerald Horne and Robin Kelly. In this talk, I want to explore some of the work of and Margaret Stevens, I should say, read her book.
It's amazing.
In this talk, I want to explore some of the work of communists to take on empire and global white supremacy. There is much, I think, still to learn from the communists of the 1920s and 30s. The talk is going to have three parts. First, I want to tell three stories that capture solidarity and internationalism as they were practiced. Second, I'm going to unpack these stories and give some context for what made them possible. And finally, I want to draw out some lessons based on how these activists' achievements were made. First, the three stories. Spring 1927. British officials are strengthening their presence of troops in China as a revolutionary situation develops. Pratam Singh and Ratan Singh, South Asian migrants working under the auspices of the Ghadar Party and the Communist International, traveled to Shanghai to organize Indian troops and private security men, hoping to turn them against the British. According to reports sent back to the Comintern in Moscow, they achieved modest success. But as the Chinese Revolution founders and British police identify the Ghadar organizers, the two activists come to face severe punishment. News of this danger is relayed then to activists in America's Pacific Coast who work to organize safe passage for their comrades out of China. Spring 1931. James W. Ford, an African-American activist, assumes a position as an anti-colonial organizer in Hamburg. He visits the docks daily to meet with sailors from Africa, India, and China. He invites these workers to visit his office at the local Interclub, a meeting house for sailors where he teaches a weekly class on the colonial question and labor struggles in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. To demonstrate the achievements of communism, he leads tours of Soviet ships docked at Hamburg, highlighting how the crew relate to each other as equals and comrades. For select recruits, Ford holds evening workshops on the theory of communism and how to conduct practical work, including the underground distribution of anti-colonial pamphlets and journals such as the Negro Worker and the Pan-Pacific Worker. He also welcomes students from Africa, the West Indies, and the US who stop in Hamburg on their way to Moscow, where they attend university. Ford introduces these travelers to German comrades who help them complete their travels eastward. Winter 1931. Los Angeles police raid a Communist Party meeting, arresting scores of activists and workers. Among them are dozens of Japanese American radicals and one East Indian Ghaddarite assigned by the party to recruit African American workers in Los Angeles County. Charges are eventually dropped, but the migrant activists face deportation to their homelands, where they face certain imprisonment, if not death. After a successful campaign led by the ILD, an organization mainly remembered for organizing around the Scottsboro case that you heard about a little bit this morning, it is arranged for these Asian American radicals to be sent to the Soviet Union, where they hope to continue their revolutionary work in exile. And the slide I have up for that, I picked a rather boring slide for a reason. It's about fundraising and the hard work of getting money to save people's lives. Sometimes activism looks very courageous and dramatic, and sometimes it's about calling someone to raise another 50 cents in order to save their lives. I wanted to capture both parts of that story because I know a lot of us do that boring work, and sometimes it feels quite dreary. There's a long tradition of doing that work, and it does save people's lives. So I wanted to have this little flyer, not flyer, this little accounting that I found in the archives up there to sort of document that part of the struggle as well. These three stories testify to the efforts to build a global anti-colonial movement within the Communist International in the 1920s and 30s. When world revolution failed to spread in Europe following October 1917, communists turned to Asia and later Africa and the West Indies. In fact, Lenin, among others, had already argued for the liberation of colonies and self-determination before the revolution. The formation of the Communist International in 1919 and the Comintern's adoption of an anti-colonial position in 1920 established the basis for revolutionary work in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. But how would this work be carried out, and who would organize it? These questions remained unanswered. Of course, we should remember that people didn't need to read Lenin's Imperialism to express their objections to imperial rule. Before 1917, there was already revolutionary activity in China, Mexico, and Ireland, among other places. Anti-colonial ambitions were heightened by the events of World War I that pitted European powers against each other and diminished their strength. A number of anti-colonial movements built transnational networks to evade police, procure arms, and gather resources to fuel their struggles. It is important to remember the late 19th century age of empire was also an age of migrations. As a variety of forces, including dispossession and famine, unsettled people from their homelands, many relocated to the United States, including migrants from the Caribbean, China, Japan, and British India. These migrations established diasporic pathways for radical activity with important nodes throughout the United States. The East Indian who was deported from Los Angeles, mentioned above, had arrived in the United States after his father lost his family farm in the Punjab. He was connected to other Ghadar branches in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. And this map is a select representation of some of the places where this anti-colonial activity was already happening. Credit goes to Eliza Bettinger, who's sitting right there, who made the map for me. And it helps sort of show that even before there was an internationalism adopted by the Communist International, there was already places of activity happening, the work of the Comintern then became, how do we start to organize that work under a common banner? One of those branches is also Chinese nationalists of the Kuomintang, and you can find their nodes throughout the Chinese diaspora in Asia and the Americas. Anarchists and socialists who faced repression in Japan worked in exile in the United States. Garveyites built a global organization with over 700 branches throughout the African diaspora. When the Comintern turned to anti-colonial work in Asia and Africa, the Communist Party in the United States took up this work through these networks. In some cases, the anti-colonialists turned to them. Many were inspired by the successful revolution in the Soviet Union and Lenin's state and revolution, and as well as imperialism. They sought to leverage the resources of the Comintern to advance their struggles against European and American empires. At the same time, communists sought to win over militant activists already committed to revolutionary struggle or to transform existing left political tendencies. This may be the first lesson in internationalism to learn from communist anti-colonialism: build on what already exists. Their practice of internationalism was not the implementation of some abstract plan of proletarian unity. Rather, it followed existing networks of diasporic radicalism and built on the strength of previous victories. The next lesson, however, is just as important: keep building. Anti-systemic movements follow paths carved by capitalism, but they also forge new geographies, connections, and bonds of solidarity. At the international level, this coordinated anti-colonial work took shape in the League Against Imperialism, which had its founding conference in Brussels in 1927. But this anti-colonial internationalism was practiced at the local level when Black communists in Chicago organized hands-off China rallies, or Japanese-American socialist Katayama Sen fought to place African-American struggles at the center of American communist work. West Indian journalist George Padmore connected the Scottsboro defense to the Meerut conspiracy as a common project of white terror, a provocative double entendre capturing the connection between capitalist anti-radicalism and racial oppression. In his work on Black internationalism, historian Minka Makalani has described these connections as intercolonialism. I sometimes call this form of anti-colonial internationalism practices across diasporas to capture the ways that existing diasporic radicalisms were transformed under the banner of the Comintern. These internationalist bonds were not based on ad hoc alliances or bonds of sympathy. Rather, communist anti-colonialists embraced the most important lesson of Leninism: the concrete analysis of concrete conditions to determine revolutionary possibilities for working people. Many communists traveled to Moscow to study and produce works of political analysis and history. Katayama wrote a series of articles that stressed the centrality of racism to questions of world revolution. In his view, racism restrained movements among white workers in the US and Europe. At the same time, experiences of state violence, exploitation, and dispossession encouraged militancy among racialized workers. These commonalities formed a basis for multiracial and internationalist organization. Such analyses deepened the Marxist engagement with issues of race and empire. In their urge to build solidarity across differences, communist anti-colonialists were not blind to the varieties of racial oppression. While George Padmore and other Black activist intellectuals sought to forge unities, they were also attentive to the differences between workers in the colonial West Indies, America's Deep South, and various corners of the African continent. They understood that capitalism and empire must be confronted across the globe. One lesson to learn was to identify common experiences to unite on common demands. But most activists also understood the importance of local specificities, that different histories resulted in different forms of revolt. Solidarity, as we must understand, is not about erasing differences, but a common struggle across them. Solidarity is also about the achievement of something new. Across differences, the Comintern's internationalists forged commonalities as communists. Students traveling to Moscow would often only have a slip of paper or fabric with a stamp on it to vouch for their credentials. Based only on this, they would depart for European ports where local communists took them in. Part of James Ford's work in Hamburg was to connect colonial seamen and traveling students to German communists who arranged safe passage. The internationalism and solidarity of the Comintern depended on a tremendous level of trust and confidence. To be a communist meant that you would risk harm or imprisonment to smuggle journals and pamphlets past censors, evade police, and protect your comrades. It is not happenstance that the two of the three stories I told at the beginning involved mutual aid and defense. As a result of this bold reimagining of diasporic radicalism's concrete analyses of race and empire and courageous acts, American anti-colonialists were able to connect struggles from Hawaii to Haiti, the Jim Crow South to Japan, Lahore to Lagos, and so on. In doing so, they produced a set of theories and practices that foregrounded racism and anti-colonialism and anti-capitalist struggles across existing identities and borders. This is not to say that they did not make errors along the way. Perhaps the biggest failure was to rely too much on one center. Moscow was a crucial location for organizing, reflection, and material support. Such centers are essential to movement work, something that our hosts at the People's Forum surely understand. But when Moscow collapsed as a location for anti-colonial work for a variety of reasons, much of the work of 2 decades of activism was lost. I don't think that the lesson of this error is to embrace some anarcho-syndicalist vision of organizing without any centers. But it is an important caution against reliance on only one center. The failure to take on patriarchy and its place in capitalism and empire was also an organizational and analytical error, if not an uncommon one at the time. I'm not asserting that women played no role in the anti-racist and anti-colonial activism of the Comintern, or that communists paid no attention to women's activism. When the first issue of Negro Worker was being planned in Moscow, Katayama was approached to write about women protesting in Kenya. Black women, including Maud Katz, Louise Rivers, and Jane Golden, attended Toilers University in Moscow and produced reports on trade union activity among American women. Afro-Chinese Trinidadian dancer Seelan Chen attempted to combine modern dance, feminism, and anti-racism in performances across the Soviet Union. But on the whole, anti-colonial rebellion was imagined in masculinist terms. Errors, of course, are inevitable, but that should not blind us to the more important lessons of solidarity and internationalism that were essential to the achievements of communist internationalism. I have 7 here because I like to end with takeaway lessons. First one, as I said, build on what exists. Internationalism didn't come out of nowhere. It came on looking at the actual what's in front of you and what can be pushed further. And I said, the second part, keep building. Make connections between existing movements. Base your work on concrete analyses of concrete conditions. And this is the most important thing I think about Lenin. Don't base it on liberal sympathies. Look at what's actually happening, analyze commonalities, move forward. Fourth one, establish centers to coordinate this work and for analysis and reflection. Moscow was important. It's not the only place. There are many centers that need to be built up to have this work. Be bold and courageous in your work to inspire trust and confidence needed to achieve new unities. Organize defense to protect your bold and courageous activists and comrades. And finally, never forget that revolution is possible. New societies can be made, or as we say today, I believe that we can win.
Thank you, everyone. This has been really it's exciting to be here, to hear these panels, to hear these talks. Thoughts that sometimes you feel like they're only happening in your head as you're doing your work, or to make sure that we're here together and thinking alongside each other feels powerful and wonderful. I want to say thank you to the organizers of this entire day, and to the People's Forum and all of the people who made the lunch possible, setting up the space as we do the work. We're literally making the space as we're in it. In terms of construction last night, I was very impressed. I want to also thank the witches, I think, alongside, Janetta Candelario, Jennifer Guillermo, Daphne Lamoth, and Michelle Hofroy, and I'll just start. So I've called this Peace and the Barrel of the Gun, Decolonizing the International Women's Movement. It's really 1948-49, but beginning in 1945, building on precisely the histories that Ani has just been talking about. So in 1949, this picture here is of Kai Chang, Deng Yingzhao, and Song Qingling, all at the All-Asian Women's Conference in 1949, held in newly liberated People's Republic of China. 198 delegates from all of them were part of the Women's International Democratic Federation. Let's see if this can move it back just a little bit. Attended this conference. It was their second international conference after the founding of the PRC. The first was a trade union conference, and one day later in Beijing, this conference was held, called the All-Asian Women's Conference. In her opening welcome to the conference, the Vice President, Kai Chang, celebrated the long odds of this gathering. She said, "Many delegates from the Asiatic countries have risked their lives to come to the conference. crossing firing lines and outwitting the watchfulness of secret agents and detectives to arrive at their destination. The conference realized a long-held goal to bring together socialist women's organizations and communist organizations. Several of the women who attended this conference had founded or co-founded their communist organizations, such as from Madagascar and from Ivory Coast. It opened on December 10th, 1949. It lasted for 7 days in the Winter Palace of the Forbidden City. There were delegates from 14 Asian countries, and Asia was one of those definitions that was wide, including Syria, including Lebanon, as well as a co-conference that was organized in Japan because the MacArthur government would not allow the Japanese women to attend this conference. There were also 33 fraternal delegates from around the world, and they listened to speeches and country reports. In the evenings, they talked about, or in the reports that I found, they danced the Korean Lindy Hop, which I have not yet found a clip that I could add to this talk. Listening to experimental music, international music experiments that were coming out of the Chinese Revolutionary Movement. And they also toured Shanghai and Huairou after the conference ended. From WIDIF's inception in 1945, so what I'd like to talk about is a strategy of a feminist internationalism that linked anti-imperialism to anti-racism to anti-fascism. These were not incidental, they were not equated, they were brought together in a way that maintained their distinctiveness. As they said, we cannot survive with all of these together, without all of these together. So out of this conference, I'm arguing that really from 45 to 49, they were developing a strategy that I'd like to think about. And I feel so happy to do it alongside people who are thinking about these questions from so many different places. And this is a work in progress, so I really mean think alongside. The conference crafted 2 appeals, and this comes out of that two-camp moment, right, of Zhadanov in 1947, where they're saying, rather than a united front from above, where we bring people together for an anti-colonial struggle for self-determination, what we're doing here is a united front from below. We're organizing peasant people, rural people, where the masses of people are, to build a united front drawing from their demands. Out of this came this, what's shorthanded as the two-camp theory, where there were imperialist countries and there were countries of a deep-lived democracy. So this is that moment. So they crafted these 2 appeals, one to Asian women and the other to women from imperialist countries. The first sought women's unity for the entrenched battles ahead. The second mapped what women's internationalist solidarity should be. Both appeals demanded a just peace. Both supported the militancy of the struggle to secure this peace. Asian delegates, but also leaders who traveled from Cuba, Ivory Coast, Algeria, Madagascar, all came from movements that put rural women at the center. Their speeches and conference documents explicitly named the linkages, as I had said before, anti-racism, anti-fascism to anti-imperialism, confronting head-on the underlying humanitarian colonial consensus, right, that was the doxa in many places, even after 1945, even in European communist parties of this period, right? The 3 main fissures of the conference sparked important debates. I'm going to focus on one of them, but I wanted to just outline them for you here. First was the analysis of post-war imperialism, for anti-colonial nationalism in particular. The second was the significance of revolutionary violence. And the third was the character of women's internationalism. These were difficult debates, with many complex histories brought to the table that had been going on inside anti-colonial national movements for decades, as Ani's paper suggests, and did not cross borders or seas easily. These were still not settled. So I'll briefly outline these and then come to the strategy that was developed at this conference. Between 1948 and 1949, WIDIF, this is the Women's International Democratic Federation, debated how to understand the dynamic of imperialism in the second half of the 20th century as territorial colonial occupation faced its violent end. Now we think of this as a surety, there was nothing sure about it, right? This is 1945, It seemed destined to happen, but the fighting continued. It wasn't done. A year before the Asian Women's Conference in 1948, Kai Chang addressed WIDIF's Second Congress that was held in Budapest, Hungary. She said, "After the war, the national independence movement in the countries of Asia and Africa has won unprecedented victories. Armed struggle is at present the characteristic feature of this movement." Delegates to WIDIF's Second Congress in 1948, which was large, fully supported Kai's unapologetic embrace of armed freedom movements as the necessary response to colonial exploitation. Kai described the growing complexity of imperialism in her speech between the older colonial nations and the rise of American-led financial imperialism, marked by the dominance of the dollar and Wall Street. Both forms of imperialism agreed on this point, that there were military solutions, as she said, to wiping out every movement for national liberation. Kai reminded her audience that the United States was the true victor of World War II, gaining hegemony, won through its capital reconstruction loans to Europe and England. She linked movements in Africa, including labor struggles in the Gold Coast, to those in Asia, citing the oil workers' strikes in Iran as well. She spoke about the food shortages in China that led to peasant uprisings against the Kuomintang, and starvation in India that fueled peasant resistance to large landowners in Bengal. All of those struggles included women workers on the land and in factory, exploited even more intensely by lower wages and longer hours. And one of the demands that I don't have in this paper, but I'm working on developing, was a revolutionary demand against a domestic terrorism of endemic violence in the home. So one of the things that was coming out of these peasant struggles as a revolutionary struggle out of revolutionary movements was an anti-violence call. But that's another paper. The intensity of working class, rural and urban organizing alongside alliances with progressive middle classes, this is that united front from below, finally gave the anti-colonial movement around the world the strength it needed to win. And this is the argument that Kai was making at the end, and it had a strength in the conference. Colonial powers' use of violent force to retain colonial territories continued unabated after the war, if not fiercer than before. Economies of the Netherlands, England, and France still relied upon colonies' wealth in resources, labor, captive consumer markets, perhaps even more desperately in the war's aftermath. But brute force and bad faith agreements to share power no longer sufficed to hold on to power. Kai's analysis ended with 3 goals of women's ongoing praxis: peace, self-determination, and a democracy that eradicated poverty and starvation to provide, as she said, the freedom to live under human conditions. So the second issue, again, one I'm going to go over briefly, revolutionary violence. On the international stage of the United Nations, WIDIF activists reiterated that a world peace that left imperial power unchecked was an empty slogan. Armed resistance in the colonies was not synonymous with war, but necessary to gain peace. The harsh nature of colonial violence, including the character of counterinsurgency wars, which were across Asia in the moment of this conference, allowed few options for nonviolent resistance in the colonies. The debate among the delegates of the Asian Women's Conference wasn't about the violence itself, but about methods for international support, and deeply linked to their strategies for meaningful internationalism. At this gathering, Asian and African delegates solidified a praxis that amplified internationalist women's material solidarity for these struggles. And this is the praxis I'm interested in here today. The necessity of armed struggle echoed other recent internationalist gatherings in Asia, most notably the World Federation of Democratic Youth and Students, the WFDY, a conference that was held in Kolkata in February of 1948. There's also the Second Congress of the Indian Communist Party, which was later in 1948, where this two-camps theory started to take root and take forms of struggle. Within months of the WFDY conference, military, and this was not predicted, this wasn't part of the conference plan, this is This is what emerged out of it. Within months of the conference, military resistance to colonialism broke out in Myanmar in March of 48, in the Philippines, in Malaysia in June of 1948, in Indonesia in September of 1948. By 1949, vast sections of Vietnam had gained a formal independence, particularly North Vietnam, that proved fragile in the face of French determination to hold on to the territory as its colony. The broken promises for a slow transition to full independence proffered after the end of World War II by England in Myanmar and Malaysia, by France in Vietnam, and by Holland in Indonesia resulted in armed resistance. In 1948 and 49, the Indonesian independence movement had taken up the few arms available to them through channels that led from India through Myanmar and from China through Vietnam. Many rural people fought with handmade wooden weapons and explosives left over from the end of Japanese occupation. Meanwhile, the French, British, and Dutch, with the active assistance of the United States, colluded to support each other's military counterinsurgency assaults by lending troop regiments, arms, military ships, planes, and other equipment from the region used against the Japanese during World War II. And in the spirit of, Ani, of your lessons, I think the lack of parity in the struggles, maybe that's one of the other lessons we can come to at our current moment. This was waged with full military hardware. I've read the reports of peasant women using the iron frying pans, the tavas, from their fireplaces. These were wooden staves, farming equipment. These were asymmetrical in the extreme battles, right? It's worth reminding ourselves. Ling Long, one of the two delegates from Malaysia, spoke bluntly about their independence war, led by the Malaysian workers of Chinese descent, who were miners and agricultural workers. She said, "The Chinese in Malaya are inspired by the struggle of the Chinese against Japan and Kuomintang, and also by the struggle of Indonesians for their independence. The people's forces work underground in towns and cities and work amongst the peasantry in the countryside, taking up arms where necessary." Ling reiterated that for most of the Asian delegates, particularly those from Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Korea, and notably the Japanese delegation, which I mentioned was having the parallel conference in Tokyo, women's work in their revolutions were clandestine and life-threatening. Many of the WIDF's international demands for women's rights assumed that women already enjoyed some form, even if limited, of representative governance, such as the demands for the right to own property and divorce at will. These were all aspirations shared by Asian, Latin American, and African women. However, for those under colonial occupation, women's rights were woven into the aspiration for a socialist government that affirmed their rights to exist, to take leadership, to have a voice, to self-determination, and as I said, to live without violence. They fought for both simultaneously, and WIDF, they argued, had to mirror their commitments. Okay. So a year before this conference in 1948, Kai Chang defined the terms for WIDF's internationalist activism that inspired the most creative debates in Beijing. Creative and contentious, I should add. Kai paraphrased Lenin for her slogan that echoed throughout many of the proceedings. "A people which oppresses another cannot itself be free." We've still got this, right? This is still circulating amongst us. "A people which oppresses another cannot itself be free." This slogan, heard so many times over the 6 days of this earlier conference in Budapest, threaded together emergent political strategies. Women across Africa and Asia demanded freedom with peace. European and American women needed to act with equal urgency, Kai declared, though from a distinctly different location. And here we can start to see how the geopolitics of this was happening. Speaking directly to the women from imperialist nations, she explained this in 1948. I think I missed some slides. Okay, so here's the conference. Way back then. I love the picture of the movie camera there. There's 2 movies that came out of this, neither of which I've been able to find, one made by the Chinese and one made by the USSR. I've read a lot of discussions of them. Apparently, a lot of the film got burnt up, so they had to reshoot it after the conference and pretend they were at the conference. Yeah. One day, this will be found. Here's Deng Ying Chao speaking at the conference. Here's Betty Millard in the corner. I haven't yet had the chance to identify the woman with the scarf in the left-hand side. At the book and art table at the conference, and then I thought you might want to see one of the pieces that came out of the conference. This one got a little damaged in travel. It's a Nianhua print, and on the back, Betty Millard had written in translation, these two women in the front, "We have our land certificates. We must increase production. Better days are coming." So I think one of the things that we lose in just reading the speeches is the sheer depth and breadth and vivacity and cultural sort of joy of the conference, which is coming out more in the journals that I found than in the documents. Okay, so let's get into, I think, do I have 5 minutes? Kind of, not? Okay, super fast. We'll get into the strategy that they were developing. So what it required, oh, and there's one more. So this is Kai Cheng in 1948. This is the strategy that they were outlining. So she's talking about the slogan, "A people which oppresses another cannot itself be free." The women of Holland must ceaselessly demand the cessation of colonial war and the recall of the troops from Indonesia. The slogan must be adopted by women from other imperialist countries, above all those in the United States. They must help their sisters, not only because they are moved by a sentiment of justice, but because the struggle of the women in dependent countries against the oppressors is part of the fight for peace and democracy. Right? This is not a simple language of allyship. This is something much deeper, something much more dangerous than that. Baya Alouche, of the General Secretary of the Algerian Women's Union, presented a clear picture of post-war imperialism and solidarity. She talks about the fight against, let's see if I have this as a quote. No, this is the earlier one. All right. That Algeria is, in fact, this is Alouche from the women's movement in Algeria. Algeria is, in fact, a colony of France with political, economic, and social inequalities and the crushing of national culture. War is being prepared before the eyes of the people. Algerian troops have been sent to Vietnam, and Algerian women have protested against this. So there's a level of solidarity, of a demand for independence on the basis of their own location. And when she says, "We protested this," this is in the face of incredibly violent repression, right? This is not just a march through the streets. This is the loss of your home, of your food, of your health, of your strength, right? So this solidarity, what I've been calling the solidarity of complicity, had consequences, and women paid them in full. In 1948, a delegation of women from the U.S. Congress of American Women attended this same conference in Hungary. 3 of them, 2 black and 1 white, joined the Asian Women's Conference a year later. This Elizabeth Millard, Ada Jackson, and Islanda Robeson. In 1948, co-participants expressed the difficulty of organizing around Wittef's resolutions that named the United States as the central imperialist aggressor. The political context in the Cold War, they said, would make their organization's survival impossible. But in fact, Wittef's final document did name the US as the primary imperialist. The clarity of their resolution and the focus and the resolve of CAW to bring it to American women had the very consequences they foresaw. By 49, CAW members were charged with subversion by HUAC. By 1950, CAW was banned. Yet in 1951, right, a year later, these same women put their bodies on the line to stop the US war against Korea. The Asian Women's Conference culminated in 2 appeals for a movement peopled by rural farmers fighting guerrilla wars against wealthy, powerful forces armed to the teeth. They emphasized differential relations of solidarity to describe what resistance to colonial aggression meant. Their appeal to Asian women connected their participation as the means to support their demands for full rights. And this might be the one that is next. No. Women of the countries of Asia, workers, peasants, white-collar workers, intellectuals, remember that in unity lies our strength and the guarantee of victory over imperialism and feudal reaction. Sisters suffering under the burden of imperialism and the yoke of reaction unite, and in uniting, take into consideration the concrete conditions prevailing in our respective countries, adapt them to all available forms of struggle. Again, you can hear that difficulty of crossing borders in Asia. This wasn't an easy formation. This wasn't a geographical certainty of unity and struggle. This is something that requires specificity and thinking through what it means for location. So the second conference appeal was for women of imperialist countries, women naming US, Britain, France, and Holland. They described the shared violence and losses of colonial wars that affected all women, but they added a special ethical imperative. Do not allow yourselves to be accomplices to our murderers. Do not permit our sons to kill each other. Stop colonial wars. Insist that your governments recall the troops from Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaya, Korea. Motherhood in this appeal had no outside to war. Women must refuse to raise sons who become murderers. They linked home to the theater of war. Both appeals relied on a shared analysis of imperialism for two powerful aims. First, they celebrated the leadership of Asian women fighting British, American, French, and Dutch colonial militarism. Second, they promoted an internationalism led by these revolutionary anti-colonial women. One conference example of this praxis with Laila Surupnu, an Indonesian delegate to the Asian Women's Conference, was also a member of the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI. Women were part of all anti-imperialist resistance movements. They were fighters. They provided logistical support. They did surveillance, communication, and infrastructure. She emphasized the role of women in these battles. She said, Indonesian women fight with arms in hand for national independence. Surupnu spoke before Maria Lips, the chairwoman of the Dutch women's movement and also a communist. Together they showed what concerted anti-imperialist solidarity should be. Surupnu emphasized Indonesian women's full participation in the fight against Dutch military attack. Lips described Dutch women's opposition at the shipyards, sending off arms to colonial soldiers in Indonesia. This praxis, solidified between 1945 and 1949, challenged and ultimately changed the pro-colonial wings of the European communist parties, particularly the Dutch and French ones. We ignore women's militancy of this period at our peril. In the years after the Asian Women's Conference, women increasingly became the public face of revolutionary peace through a discourse of motherhood, and that's the other part of this project. However, this praxis never forgot that anti-colonial struggles were won and lost by the barrel of a gun. Thank you.
My paper is called Mapping Communist Internationalism and Class Struggle Then and Now. I'm centering this around the Puerto Rico Brigade in historical context. So I just came from a brigade that I organized with a comrade out of Brooklyn. We went to Puerto Rico in the aftermath of the hurricane, trying to keep my book alive. So my book is about the period from 1919 to 1939, and it was sort of like, we can't stop. So that's what I'm going to be drawing parallels between and talking about some of the key lessons. So go ahead. You can let it go. What you're looking at here, you can't see the title, but this is called The African Slave Trade in 2 Minutes. And I use this. I've usually already taught, I teach world history among other things, and I've usually already taught about the slave trade, and then I use this, or sometimes I start with this and then I teach the lecture. And so all those dots, each one of those dots is a ship. So if you click on any of those dots, my brother, can you somehow grab one of those dots? You might want to pause it and then, click. Does anything pop up? Okay, so you might have to grab it in motion. I don't remember how it works. But what happens is if you catch it maybe while it's in motion, I forget, because it is hard to catch the dots. that information it's hard. The information populates. It tells you how many Africans boarded the ship in Africa, where they boarded in Africa, what European flag was flying the ship, and where the ship lands, and how many Africans made it when they got there. So, yeah. So just play it, and I'm gonna stop talking. Just watch this over the next couple seconds. Just look at it for yourself. Think about what you see. Everybody's gonna take away something different. So everybody's going to take away something different. So there are a couple of things I want to do with this. I'm going to go ahead and pose the main question first, but then unpack it a little bit and then move into the book itself. The question I wanted to pose is, this here, that's simply looking at the Africans, right, over maybe a 300-year period. What happens if, in addition to this, we layered on top of this all of the poor Europeans who came across to the New World also, right? And then what if we also start to bring in the Indians who start to come over in the mid-1800s to South America and the Caribbean, right? Basically what we're seeing is part of the formation of the international working class. But if you just look at this, what you see is diaspora, right? That's the word we're going to use. We're going to call this the African diaspora, right? Because it's easier for some of us to want to think that that was reality and that's it, because that's the part we chose. But in reality, it was this, plus all these ships coming over from Europe, plus all these ships coming over from Asia. And so we're talking about the creation of the international working class. And the first time in history, you had a group of people who were really trying to deal with that complexity of that reality, of this layered with the white and the Asian working class. That was the communists. They were the first ones who really tried to deal with the beast that this working class reality, what that capitalist beast was and what we're going to do to overturn it, right? So prior to that, you have the indispensable and critical history of African maroons. You have the history of slave revolts. You have, the history of Bacon's Rebellion. You have all these wonderful examples of working class resistance. But what I would like for us to be able to imagine is, if you think about Ani, I call him Peanut, if you think about Ani and Lisa's presentations, what if we could take everything they just told us and turn it into a digital layering? Because the way they did this, I'm assuming some grad students or some college kids did this, what they must have done is gotten some Excel sheet and put, right, each slave ship, each amount of they somehow created a thing and then they digitized it. So what could happen if we could digitize all of these college students coming from all over the world to go to Moscow, or we could digitize all the people who showed up at the conference in 49, right? And we could show where they came from. What would happen if we could digitize these things? What would it motivate us to do? What type of feeling? Because when my students see this, they're mad. They're like, what? Oh, that's the reason why, if my student's from Ecuador, oh, that's the reason why we eat this, or, because they understand the role of Africa better in their history, right? Things they're not going to know because they're taught to be racist, but they start to see it like, wow. So what would happen if young working class people could see a digital presentation of communist revolutionary activity from 1919, from the Bolshevik Revolution to the 60s and 70s? What would that do in 2 minutes? And you could click on each dot and see what flyers were smuggled from Hamburg. You could see what flyers were smuggled from Hamburg to wherever, and what the flyer said, and who wrote the flyer, and who got jailed for the flyer. What would it do, right? But we don't have that. So it's on us, it's on you to create that. But you're only going to create that if you think it matters. So we're really here to try to encourage you to think that it matters, because we need help creating these types of things. So with that long preface, I'm going to keep the rest of it pretty short. Yeah, I talked about that already. So my book, Red International, Black Caribbean, I just want to read 2 paragraphs from the book to give you a sense of where my particular orientation comes from. So the way I started the book, this is the first page. And this is important for me because I am a Black communist, and I need to, grapple with the complexity and reality of what that means, right? So a truth little known and even less understood is that Black workers in the West Indies were critical to the historical development of communism between World War I and II. This revolutionary praxis was not a provincial phenomenon. Rather, communists and Black workers in the Anglophone, English-speaking, Francophone, French-speaking, and Hispanophone, I don't think that's a word, Spanish-speaking Caribbean, as well as in New York City and Mexico, were collectively implicated in an eruption of progressive forces whose magnitude was manifested at local, hemispheric, and indeed global levels. Several points must be made plain. First, the anti-racist legacy of communism cannot be fully assessed without examining the struggles of Black workers in the colonial outposts of empire. Second, it is incumbent upon scholars of 20th century Black radicalism not to offer revisionist paradigms, i.e. paradigms that retroactively obscure or even worse erase the communist organizations which often anchored the fight for freedom from racist oppression in which so many Black working people were historically engaged. And for me, that was the biggest frustration coming up. I'm like, they always separate Black radicalism from communism. I'm like, no, that can't be true, because who am I? And so in reality, it's not true, right? Like in reality, really the best communist work was the work that understood that fighting racism was critical to overthrowing capitalism. And I don't just mean racism, I mean colonialism. It's all different forms of the same concept, which is super exploitation. What super exploitation means is that white workers are exploited, and then people of color and women are exploited worse. It's very simple, right? But so communists understood that, you got to go to the roots, you got to go to the worst places. This is what they're talking about in order to overturn the entire beast. So that's the sort of thesis of the book. But then, of course, being a dialectician, right, which means you can't just ever look at the good, you got to look at the contradiction. The primary contradiction in which this work is preoccupied is the following. The medium through which communists collectively organized between World War I and II is what's called the Comintern. You've heard them mention it. That's the Communist International. It's, short for Communist International. The Comintern reinscribed rather than overturned several of the weaknesses embedded in the capitalist oppression that they were trying to challenge. First, the Comintern created individual, distinct national parties. So you got a Communist Party of Cuba, Communist Party of Puerto Rico, Communist Party of the United States, Communist Party of China, Communist Party of South Africa, Communist Party of Mexico, right? So distinct parties that would in turn act as a coalition under the direction of the Soviet Union as a means of forging international classless society. And while such a mobilization opened the door to hitherto non-existent opportunities, against fighting racism, colonialism, fascism, and that's the main point we make, is that it opened up the door to something no one had ever done before. What we also want to say is that each of these parties, and even the Soviet Union, was to some degree bound within the limitations of a nation-state social construct that negated elements of this emancipatory project. Second, the Comintern created individual organizations, committees, and bureaus for addressing what it termed the colonial and Negro questions, right? So when you're a real fighter for freedom, you can't, there's no such thing as a Negro question. It is the question. I don't care where you are, whether you're in, doesn't matter, because it's the fundamental. Did you see that? It's the question, right? So, you know, they helped us figure that out. We can't be too mad at them for not getting it fully right, but the point is they didn't get it fully right, right? So I'm gonna just, what was my final sentence? Examination of the years from 1919 to 1939 in the region in question, and I focus on the Caribbean, points toward the tremendous pioneering efforts in social, political, and economic empowerment for Black workers in this communist matrix. At the same time, this book reveals that the Comintern in significant ways succumbed to elements of the very racism and national chauvinism that it, in so many ways, had weakened. So the example I want to briefly give before I move on to Puerto Rico and then I end this out is that I think Ani mentioned it, 31, 32, 33, the big major issue that communists around the world used was the Scottsboro case, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. And the reason the Scottsboro case was useful from so many angles. Now, what some of us might not know is that workers in Haiti were locked up for defending the Scottsboro boys. So where in the United States you might just be forced to dissolve or go home, the points that they both made, you know, the point is that coming from the most oppressed, the conditions for fighting back against that oppression are harder. They're worse. The repression is worse. So if you're in Haiti and you're a Black worker and you're fighting to defend the Scottsboro boys, which can only happen because communists are bringing flyers into Haiti, translated into Creole, so that Black workers in Haiti can learn what's going on, you know, you get locked up or disappeared for that, right? The stakes are much higher. Now, well, why would Black workers in Haiti defend the Scottsboro boys? Part of the reason is because a few years earlier, 1929, a huge general strike broke out in Haiti. Bunch of conditions I talk about in one of my chapters. And communists in New York called it the Haitian Revolution. And they said, defend the Soviet Union, support the Haitian Revolution, hands off Haiti. So Haitians in New York and Brooklyn were like, whoa, you guys consider this a Haitian revolution? You care more about our taxi cab drivers getting killed than, you know, a lot of people. So it built a form of internationalism and solidarity that meant that, you know, over these next couple years, people were starting to gravitate towards this radicalism. A Haitian Communist Party is founded through this reciprocity and organizing back and forth. Now, I'm gonna just fast forward and make this point. With all this great work that's going on, one of the real headquarters of communism, because Ani was saying, listen, the center can't just be Soviet Union. It wasn't just the Soviet Union, that's the point. The problem is that the communist movement at that time wasn't as politically intelligent as their activity was. Their activity was more sophisticated than their understanding of their activity. So they had headquarters all over the world, and they were sleeping on these headquarters. That's the problem. They were sleeping on these headquarters, right? So they had this huge headquarters in Cuba. One of their headquarters was this place called Realengo 18. It was full of Black peasants from the earlier period who all talked about the Soviet Union and Cuba and how there was this huge, I mean, this is part of where Castro comes from, or why Castro was possible. And so here's the thing. Then 1935 hits, and 1935 is the Popular Front Against Fascism. Well, what happens in 1935, I leave this out of my book. I think I was probably afraid of being looked at as too radical, so I didn't want to say it. But I'll just say it now. Above all, the primary contradiction, because this is the one we continue to make, is that the communists, they thought that you could align with lesser evil capitalists, right, in order to accomplish your mission. And we still think that. Bernie Sanders, whoever, if you voted for Obama, whatever it is, it's the same thing. You align with lesser evil capitalists, because you look at Trump and you're like, yo, who's best? So anyone, run, please, right? So I get it. So imagine if you're around with Hitler. Anyone's going to be like, yo, come on, he's the worst. Roosevelt, we know we didn't like you in 33, 34. Now it's like, listen, you were bad, but you're not that bad anymore, right? That's what the communists said during the Popular Front. So why does this matter? Here's what happens when you look at it from a Caribbean perspective. In 1933 and 34, when the communists were at their most radical moment, Jamaican and Haitian workers in Cuba were part of the revolutionary movement in Cuba. They were helping shut down plantations. They were kicking U.S. capitalists off of their sugar fields and sending them back to the U.S., right? They were part of this radical wave in Cuba under communist leadership. What happens in 35 is that the Cuban communists align themselves with the Cuban progressive bourgeoisie. And part of the deal that's made is that the Cuban bourgeoisie says, listen, we want every job in Cuba to be 50% Cuban. It's called the 50% law. So what that means was that there was a huge mass deportation of Jamaican and Haitian and other black workers back to their islands in 35. Well, a lot of these black workers who had been part of the radical movement only 1 or 2 years before, but were shafted and sent back to their countries, you know, in Haiti, they got sent back to Cuba in 35. This is still the Depression. Where do they go? The DR. Well, what's the problem with the DR in 35, 36? There's a fascist in power. Well, because Trujillo wasn't considered on the communist radar one of the great fascist threats, right? It was Hitler, Mussolini, Franco. Trujillo wasn't on that list. Well, what's the problem if Trujillo's not on your list? Now, all these Haitians trying to go to the DR to get work are going to get what? Slaughtered. So you guys have heard of the Parsley Massacre. You read Edward Donnecat, Farming of Bones. So what do the communists do when these Haitian workers are slaughtered in 37? These are the same communists who were defending the Haitian Revolution in 29. Well, in 37, you want to know what they're doing? They're writing letters to Roosevelt. Your Honor, Your Excellency, President, we're disappointed to see that so little has been done. Your Excellency, Your Honor, are you serious? This is part of what the Popular Front necessitated at that time. So, and this is all under nationalism and popular resistance. So we have to think about these things. So I think deeply about these things. And coming back to where we're at now so I don't get blamed for talking too long. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to come and say, listen, I want this book to be a praxis. I don't want this book to just, we read it and then we're like, dag, that's deep. Like I wanted it to be more than that. And my book was all about the networks between New York City and the Caribbean. It was all about these networks Ani was talking about. So when the hurricane hit, and this is probably part of the reason they give me, I'm going through a lot at my school, but when the hurricane hit, I put together a disaster committee. And the committee was led by workers, of course. You know, the higher echelons of the college, they didn't donate anything. It was all students and workers, librarians, the bursar's office, financial aid. They came together to take care of the workers, right? It's not the president. He doesn't care. It's not the VP. It's not the provost. It's the workers who took care of the workers. So, and that's why they don't like me. But anyway, I led this whole round table of workers who put together this huge campaign. We sent hundreds of boxes over to the Caribbean, right, in the aftermath of the hurricane. And then I said, nah, we're going to go further. So we got a grant, met up with some folks in New York, and we took a trip out there. So now you can transition, my dear. This is it, and we'll round it out. So we sent a group out to Puerto Rico, and yeah, it's that one. That's perfect, the one you just had, perfect. And we called it the Puerto Rico Brigade. And we called it the Puerto Rico Brigade in the same tradition. You could play it. In the same tradition as the brigades that used to go over to the Caribbean in the 30s and 40s. Same communist tradition. So we sent a group out there, and we got engaged in the local issues on the island. What are some of the major issues before and after the hurricane, the super exploitation they faced there? Well, one of them is environmental racism. As you guys are going to see, this opening scene here. And I'm gonna speak over some of this so that we can get through it. But this is a part of Puerto Rico called La Guayama, and this is a coal mine right next to a community. So the way this is positioned, the coal mine is positioned in the poor part where the wind blows. The wind blows onto the poor people's community. This is a young woman who's an activist in La Guayama. Can you turn it up?
And they have been causing a lot of problems in the community. Like here in Puente Jobos, we have huge cases of cancer and respiratory disease. And now we're working on in an investigation about how many people have died or how much people had cancer.
She's talking about children with cancer, babies with cancer. You guys have heard of this before. Same thing in the Dominican Republic. Same thing in Newark, New Jersey, where I'm from. Same thing in certain parts of the Midwest, the Bronx, right? There's nothing original to this. But the point is, it takes a certain type of revolutionary commitment to internationalism to make the point, and to go to Puerto Rico and not feel shy. In other words, not fall victim to this sort of identity politics guilt where you just listen and you don't want to feel like you're imposing your reality, right? You listen, and then you also say, listen, the same thing's happening to us, right? What are we going to do about it? So this brother is saying the same thing. He's saying that when you go to the hospital with these symptoms, they only test you for one thing. They test you for lead or something. They don't test you for all of the other contaminants, the mercury, the whatever the other things are. I forgot what he said was on the list. So this is what he's saying. So we actually brought water back with us. So if anyone here has access to water testing kits, we have all this water in New Jersey, and we need to get it tested. That's one of the things we wanted to come away with today. So can you fast forward a little bit, my dear? Just, yeah. We'll get to a future part. Yeah. So he's giving you all the things they need to have tested for. Here, this scene, we were also supporting, if you guys are familiar, the teacher strikes out there. The schools, they have used this hurricane as an opportunity to completely destroy the school system in Puerto Rico. Completely, the charterization, but you know, they started charterization here. Detroit, right? Newark. This is where they tested these attacks. Now they're taking them over to Puerto Rico on a way more massive scale. They're trying to eliminate the public school system there, right? So this is part of the point of what we're all trying to make.
De Nueva York y New Jersey, profesores y estudiantes, estamos aquí en solidaridad para dar la mano a la clase obrera que ha pasado un tiempo muy difícil en Puerto Rico y porque sabemos que no hay fronteras en cuanto a los ataques de los jefes y la clase rica. Nosotros venimos aquí de los Estados Unidos porque también estamos bajo el ataque. Todo como los Estados Unidos, el laboratorio principal de los ataques se reproducen aquí en el mundo global. Sabemos que hay una lucha y una clase.
Como decía ahorita.
So you can pause it. That's enough, I think, footage. If you hear her language even, she's with the brigade, and what she's saying is we're one class. We understand we're over here because we know the same attacks you're facing over here are the attacks we're facing back home. And the people at this protest, they loved it. But here's the thing. You know, and I want to end it. The thing is that, and this is the complexity of trying to do this internationalist work. We might consider it a victory. We went to Puerto Rico, we did this, we got the water tested. You know, people loved it when we talked about one party and one class and let's all work together. They loved it, but we came back home. They're still there. Where is the movement now? You understand? So I think that that's part of the problem is even when we write these books about the history of radicalism and communism, sometimes it's like we want to distort reality to be, we want to make it more than what it was. Like Ani said, so much of this radicalism was like lists and getting 50 cents to save someone's life. Like, it's still that way. So we still have so much nitty-gritty work to do. But I think that if we lie to ourselves about the fact that we're one working class, and if we lie to ourselves about the fact that, you know, we have to work together across racial lines, you know, black workers, we can't do it alone. We need white workers. We need we need everyone. We can't do it alone. If we lie to ourselves about this thing, we're going to be repeating the problems rather than, you know, helping to put ourselves in a higher level. So that's it. Thank you.
The second speaker alluded to revolutionary violence. If one looks at the 20s and 30s, revolutionary war is the reality of what's going on. China, the Spanish Civil War. And if you talk about the lack of a center, well, you know, the Soviet Union is supplying and helping the Chinese Revolution with weapons and tanks and artillery and small arms. Same thing going on in Spain. How do you relate that? I know the second paper did that, but that's part of the process. It can't be sort of excluded out and just emphasized as the issue of solidarity. Armed struggle is part of that, and how do you factor that in?
Let me just make sure I'm clear on what you're asking. Factor what out? The USSR?
The importance of a center.
But this was a really difficult period because at this point, while China was receiving aid, military aid to a certain degree from USSR, the same wasn't true in Indonesia. The same wasn't true in Vietnam, nor in India, nor in Malaya. In Malaysia, it wasn't happening to the same degree in this period in the 40s, which is why it became one of those markers for dissent in the Cold War scholarship around this region, is they couldn't figure out how these revolutionary insurrections were happening without USSR support. And so there's a whole debate that's still unfolding. Nobody yet has found any arms coming, military support coming from the USSR. That doesn't mean it wasn't coming to China, that China wasn't supporting some of these wars. But 1948, 1949, there's little evidence that was there.
In the unfolding of all this struggle that are taking place in terms of global radicalism or even in self-defense, is there a tendency within the national liberation movement and the communist movement to underestimate the power of imperialism, colonialism, and thereby in terms of unfolding its policy, the proposals that they have made at various intervals concerning alliances and so on and so forth in regard to formulating a winning strategy?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, Ani, I'm sure, can speak to this even more so, but I'll never forget when I was doing my research for my book, and and I hope I'm answering your question properly, I came across, you know, the stuff from Moscow, and it was directive to the Communist Party of England, the Netherlands, the US, a couple places. And what it said was, each of you, we're talking about the Caribbean, each one of you is responsible for your respective colonies. Mm-hmm. So England, it's your job to handle Jamaica and the British West Indies. America, it's your job to handle Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, because even though Haiti and Cuba are independent, they're still neo-colonies. Holland, it's your job to deal with Aruba, St. Martin, wherever. So, well, what's the problem with that? There are a billion. It's part logistical, so you get it. But part, what if there are more Jamaicans in 1925 in Harlem than there are in London? Right? But you're supposed to reinscribe the colonial British, England, Jamaican connection just because it's a colony of England? Like, the point is that their imagination of what radicalism should mean was constricted by the imperial boundaries that the ruling class had created, instead of looking at the logistics of migration, which Ani was talking about, and saying the practices of diaspora, like, look at where they're going. Like, that doesn't even make sense. No, the folks in Harlem should be really trying to connect with the people in the Caribbean because, look, that's where they're going. So I think that this is an example of the kind of thing that communists were guilty of and blind to back then. Also, I remember coming across, they sent a communist out to Puerto Rico to do some work to try to organize a party in the early 20s. And all the literature they gave him was in English. Nothing translated. He's like, bruh, listen. He's talking to like the head of the CPNU in the US. He's like, listen, are you serious? What am I supposed to do with these? So Yeah, on a very basic level, the insensitivities to colonialism were definitely reinscribed, but that's not the primary aspect of the history, and I think that's the point we're trying to emphasize.
If I'll add a little bit to that and maybe differ with Margaret a little bit. You're okay with that? I would say, I mean, they're trying to think all this through, right? This is part of what was going on in Moscow, is they're sitting in schools and they're trying to figure out what does it mean to take on empire? What does racism mean for Marxists? This is a period of incredible intellectual productivity around these questions. What does coerced labor mean? How is it a practice in different places? All these questions are things that they're thinking about. They don't have great answers, but and part of what I want to think about, so that the title of my book somewhere is Anti-Colonial Imagination, is there's all, where that comes from in part is there's this famous book about Western Marxism called The Dialectical Imagination, about the 20s and 30s and what was going on in Marxism. There's also this entire other type of Marxism that's trying to figure out race and empire in the 20s and 30s. And the anti-colonial imagination is the Marxism of the 20s and 30s that's doing that. It's trying to figure out those questions that you're bringing up. They don't have perfect answers, but you know what? That's because they live in real revolutionary struggle and times. In the same way that Gramsci's trying to figure out what revolutionary struggle will look like in Italy, Katayama's trying to figure out what that will look like in Asia, right? Padmore's trying to figure out what that will look like in Africa and the West Indies. They're trying to work it out. They ain't doing perfect, but they're doing a lot of hard work to figure out those questions. And for many of them, for the first time, putting together sort of the intellectual lineages of the Black freedom struggle with Leninism, with the political analysis, with political economy. So that they're trying to do that work. So I would say, yeah, they're not doing it perfectly, but they're actually doing a lot of work. And where I differ with Margaret a little bit, the Comintern doesn't completely reinscribe the imperial and nationalist borders, right? So if you look at, like, I know Margaret knows this, so I'm just reminding her, the ITUC-NW, right? That's not organized around a national consciousness, that's organized around the idea of a diaspora. And same thing with their sister organization, the Pan-Pacific Congress, right? That's not around just the Chinese party or the Japanese, but that's organized to think somewhat problematically in some ways, but also quite imaginatively and creatively about an Asiatic international, and thinking what trans-Pacific work would happen. And so actually, I think they're actually doing pretty good for the 20s and 30s with the material they got. So that would be my answer to you.
And if there's anyone out there who wants to do a little digging, there's actually a school in Hong Kong, I just mentioned it to Ani, in the 20s and 30s doing a lot of this revolutionary work that I've seen mention of, but I haven't seen anyone write about the school in particular. Ho Chi Minh was a constant presence there. There were Indonesian revolutionaries from at this school. So a lot of these theories were being developed from within the region as well.
Okay, so we got time for one more question.
First of all, thank you for the panel. I cannot emphasize enough just how amazed I am and just how clear and accessible and yet really insightful this was. I can't wait to go watch it again on the live stream. My question is about the revolutionary and I'm serious, and the everyday. I was thinking about the form, the mundane work of gathering money, but also through a lens of reproduction and social reproduction, thinking about that appeal to motherhood and making motherhood radical that you were talking about, Professor Armstrong, and the don't let our sons kill each other, or Professor Stevens, and the everyday role of the cab drivers. And so I've just been thinking about how the everyday struggle isn't already revolutionary, but it also is something that revolutionaries must attend to. So I just wonder if you could just talk more about that. Thank you.
Well, I remember coming across, and this wasn't even in a communist newspaper. This was in a Jamaican newspaper, I think, called Plain Talk, I think is where I read this in the 30s, mid-30s. And this was the wife of a man named Wilfred Domingo. Wilfred Domingo was very important to setting all this off. Everything we're talking about, Domingo was one of those guys, right? But he was also an individualist. He wasn't really a party man. He never really joined the party. He was always on the fringes anyway. Domingo was part of this back and forth. He helped build up the labor movement in Jamaica in the 30s. He's from Jamaica, but he was in Harlem. He helped start the communist movement among black workers in Harlem. Anyway, his wife writes into Plain Talk and says, our husbands are supposed to be out here doing all this great radical work. What we need to do is have a sit down in the kitchens. Now, she writes this in 1937, when in Flint, Michigan, the sit down had taken over the entire city and changed the structure of labor in this country, right? Like, because of the Flint sit down. Does she realize that there's a sit down strike going on in Michigan? Maybe not, but her husband knew. Right? Her husband was talking about bringing CIO-style organizing to Jamaica. So she had to, on some level, know. So what's she talking about doing in the kitchens in Jamaica? She's saying we need to have sit-down strikes in our kitchens because these men might be radical, but they're chauvinists. I don't know if they ever ended up having those sit-down strikes in the kitchen, but the point is that that kind of language, that kind of thinking, right, is symptomatic of the repression and the frustration that, at least if we start this again, we have to take much more seriously, and we can't make these mistakes again with the division of labor between the men going out, doing a lot of the work, and then the women being expected to raise the kids and maybe be activists if they have time.
Mm-hmm. Those same women that I mentioned who said that one of our revolutionary demands is a demand against violence started their own court system. And they were the judge, jury, they were it, and they heard the complaints of women in the regions. This is rural Bengal, which is now part of Bangladesh, part of India as well, and had trials and said, no, you're going to be held accountable. It wasn't exactly the lockup, but it was a accountability to the violence that they were facing in their homes, and there was labor attached, there was retribution, there was apology, and there was the promise never to do it again, and these kinds of forms of activism from within the movement, rather than a contradiction that splits it apart, it became the contradiction that allowed for new possibilities to grow out of it.
I just want to make a final point to reply to what Ani was saying, because you can't ever come for me and I'm not going to say anything back. Which is that, because he's right though, he really is. And so, but that was the point of my book, what he's saying, that the primary aspect of the contradiction was the beauty and the internationalism and the anarchy. That is the primary aspect. The problem, and the reason why I want to say this in New York, because DC is not the heart of American empire, New York is. We are right now sitting in the heart of the empire of the planet, in this room on 37th Street, if that's the right street we're on. So I want to say it here, which is that much as we were really doing all this, the communists were doing this great work across the world, and a lot of the greatest work was coming out of the Soviet Union, the complexity is that a lot of these communists committed to the internationalism in places like the United States were dealing with a level of chauvinism, American chauvinism, that they were really blind to. And that's real, right? Their chauvinism was deep. I mean, when you see the letters of these American communists trying to organize their Mexican counterparts in 1923, 30, 24, they're hiking on them. They're like, how do you want the Anti-Imperialist League to be based out of Mexico when you think that the Philippines is in the Caribbean? You don't even realize that you don't even know where the Philippines is. You can't be the head of the Anti-Imperialist League. Like, this is what the United States comrades are saying to their Mexican counterparts. They're mad at them because they might be making mistakes like this, right? Not thinking about the reason a person might be making this kind. It might be a geographical error, but it might not be a conceptual error if Filipino and Puerto Rican workers are together in Hawaii working side by side. You might have a real reason to think that maybe the Philippines and Puerto Rico are the same place, because from what you know, they work together. So, I mean, I'm saying this simply because this is a problem that we have to deal with. Right now, I'm 20 weeks pregnant, right? I've been telling everybody that. And I'm proud. Listen, let me tell you something. When you're 40 years old, that's not easy. So I had to put a lot of work in. But let me make my point. The father of the child, I mean, we get along, we're not married or anything, but he's a good guy. He wants to be here for the birth. The birth is supposed to be in February. I wasn't even thinking about the fact. I'm like, well, of course, we'll get you a visa, whatever, it's all good. He's from a shithole country, right? He's from the British Virgin Islands. He lives in Aruba. So he didn't even have a passport till recently, right? So he can't just come in February in time. I might have to marry him for him to come. I'm not doing that. You understand what I'm saying? That's not happening. But the point is, I wasn't thinking that way. With my American U.S. passport that takes me anywhere, where I can go anywhere, I wasn't, and I consider myself a sophisticated communist. I wasn't even thinking about the fact that the father can't even just get here that easily. You understand? So this is really the point I'm trying to make, is that we have the best imaginaries, the best plans, but these biases that we have are really deep-seated, and the only way to fight them is to constantly keep our work grounded in international unity, because our comrades, like he's reminding me about reality. This is the reality. He might not make it. So, you know, that was kind of the point I was trying to make.
Okay, well, let's end it there. Please join me in thanking this panel.